So I suppose we could just begin. Welcome everyone to the first webinar of Team Society after the Easter break. And I'm happy to see that quite a few people have already logged on. I'm Thomas Marshalsvold from the Department of Interdisciplinary Studies of Culture. And just 2 words about Team Society. We are a group of scholars from across NTNU who in principle do 2 things. So on the one hand, are a series of research projects that we do, but on the other hand, we also aim to promote and showcase the social science and humanities perspectives from across NTNU. And one of the ways that we do this is through this webinar series where we every other week have a scholar from one of the many relevant departments across NTNU. And today we have Diana Raquel Vele Almeida from the Department of Geography. And we have a commenter, Howard Falkenberg, from the Department of Interdisciplinary Studies of Culture. And then when these fine people are finished, we have time to discuss. So I will then simply give the digital floor to you, Diana. You'll talk about how does Europe's green transition fit into climate justice. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Thomas. First, I wanted to thank for the invitation, especially to Sarah. It's such a pleasure to be with you all here. And I'm looking forward to have a grateful conversation. I also want to thank Gilbert for accepting to be the discussant of this presentation today. Let me just put in presentation mode. Okay. I think everybody is now able to see the presentation. The presentation today is called How Does Europe's Green Transition Fit into Climate Justice? And this is coming from proposal that I wrote recently that is under analysis for funding in the Norwegian Research Council. So what I want to present here is more critical questions that I have over how Europe is thinking about transition, climate transition, or ecological transition, or green transition, whichever we want to call it. So I want to say that I will actually have more questions than answers. And the idea for this presentation will actually will be I'll invite all of you to have a conversation of what are the challenges that we currently have, what are some critical questions that we need to pose in thinking about green transition. We all know the Paris Agreement in 2015 constituted the largest international commitment on climate change. It was adopted by 195 countries, and this agreement aims at a rapid reduction of carbon emissions for keeping the global average temperature below 2 degrees Celsius compared with pre-industrial levels, and also reaching carbon neutrality by 2050. So in this context, the implementation of an energy transition as a key principle of the Paris Agreement constitutes one core action to largely reduce carbon emissions, and has been the central objective of the European Green Deal, and that is the one object that I'm going to focus in this presentation. But it's also a focus point of discussion on a possible US Green Deal with Biden now in office, and the Chinese commitment to carbon neutrality by 2060. So all the rich big economies in the world are currently thinking about how we can transition to a green economy. So in December 2019, the European Union became a prominent climate leader in building its commitment to climate action by launching the European Green Deal. And the European Green Deal proposes to halve emissions by 2030 and to target a net zero carbon by 2050, while moving towards greener European economies. To accomplish these objectives, the European Climate Law was launched in March 2020, last year, constituting a legally binding regulation to achieve climate neutrality for all EU members. So this is key because until now, all climate policies, or most climate policies, especially global policies, have not been binded. And this is the first one that is binded for, in this case, the European Union. However, I think that three key aspects remain ambiguous in the European Green Deal. And these are related to the impact on transnational supply of commodities to the Eurozone, and the lack of reference to the life cycle of the raw materials needed for the green technologies. Let's say raw and critical materials, mineral and metals for the panels, for green turbines, for the batteries, for cars, for all green technology. But also my concern is about the lack of dialogue between the European Union and associated supplied countries, and the possible economic, political, and environmental transformations that simultaneously occur in the countries of origin of such commodities. So my question here is it a win-win solution for people and the planet? When we talk about green transition, do we talk a win-win solution? Because normally, while there is a considerable increase in research on just transitions related to energy democracy, participation, and new technologies in developed countries, the perspective from the global south seems neglected or underrepresented. Despite the fact that land, workers, and raw materials located in these countries will be essential to the realization of transitions everywhere in the world. So again, as this is often represented, the green transition is represented as a win-win solution for people and the climate. The green energy transition, however, is a complex process that involves society, companies, policymakers, and also natural resources located across the globe. So it is in this critical juncture of time where the energy transition is increasingly recognized as a policy priority in the largest economies of the world. Therefore, it is critical to recognize that a long-term energy transition will require globally ambitious plans for larger material requirements of raw materials central to the construction of green technology. However, the World Bank last year, for example, published a study where it noted that the energy transition will imply a progressive decline in fossil fuel energy demands, obviously, but also an increase in the demand for metals and rare earths, and that includes tin, nickel, copper, and lithium that are needed for green technologies. In fact, this report says that by 2050, the demand will be 500 times even better than current, larger than current demand. Yet climate initiatives still place insufficient attention on the interconnected nature of the global economic systems and the challenges, impacts, and needs for transitioning in primary producer supplied countries. Considering that the material requirements for green technologies is much higher than the material need for carbon-based technologies, a transition towards a carbon-neutral economy in Europe is predicted to be highly resource-intensive, with demands for raw materials continuing to increase, even doubling current demand by 2050. Still, several challenges lie ahead in considering the climate impacts of the mining industry, as today's resource extraction and process industry is responsible for half of all the greenhouse gas emissions. That will mean that the production of renewable energy in the European Union will inevitably result in carbon leakage in third countries through the expansion of mining activities, something that the European Green Deal has not properly considered. So I think it is important then to ask what is missing in the current debate. And for that, I believe that we need an interdisciplinary debate to understand how recent climate policies, such as, again, the European Green Deal, result in modifications to the demand-supply commodity chains of critical raw materials needed for energy transition, and can generate direct and indirect economic, social, and environmental justice implications for mining producer countries globally. And this is highly pertinent because, unlike other relevant climate policies of the Paris Agreement, the European Green Deal represents, as I said, the first legally binding climate policy developed regionally that has long-term strategies for energy transition with material and discursive implications globally. Understanding the implications for social and environmental justice around supply countries is critical because of the seemingly inverse relationship between resource extraction and development, something that is maybe you all know as the resource curse, but also the significant evidence that the mining industry has accumulated a considerable number of environmental damages, and it is a repeated offender of human rights. And that has been proved in Latin America or any major extractive country globally. In-depth research needs to be conducted to understand whether the European Union is taking actions to create the spaces of dialogue abroad. And we also need to examine the interconnected nature of the metal supply chain behind green technologies. For the European Green Deal, using what I said will be a multi-scalar understanding of governance to uncover material relations between green social metabolisms taking place in Europe and destructive processes located elsewhere that provide the raw materials for such metabolisms to occur. So what is going on then on the relationship between developing countries and green transitions? And while studies have evaluated the possibilities for any country to move towards a low carbon transition, they have not yet estimated the effects of such transitions in primary producer countries. Thus, I believe the empirical studies are needed on primary producer countries because they could offer much needed examples of the global impacts of the European Green Deal in the context of just transitions. We need to explore the political economy and political ecology of producer countries around large-scale mining of raw materials, in particular to understand the country's material and discursive relation with metal extraction, existing socio-environmental conflicts around extractive zones, and the role that the European transition can play in intensifying extractivism's, therefore, conflicts. It is therefore important to examine what a context-based just transition looks from the perspective of producer countries and what role these countries see in building global just transitions. This includes examining policies proposed for just transitions in the respective country. The availability of foreign economic and technological support, for example, the capacity building among governments, civil society organizations, and business, and the political willingness for such transitions in ensuring social and ecological justice for people living in close areas, close to extraction projects. So as I mentioned, this presentation is coming from this project that I wrote that is still under the evaluation. It's called Latin American Perspectives for a Global Just Transition. And I decided to go for this project in order to provide relevant data that focuses specifically on Chile and Ecuador, whose economies are primarily based upon the extraction of resources, leading to an ever-expanding extractive-based economy to power greener transitions elsewhere. And so the reason why I chose these two countries is because Chile is arguably possessing the most consolidated copper mining industry in the world and has the largest lithium industry in Latin America. And Ecuador has a copper mining industry in its initial stages, with expectations that it will replace national revenues from fossil fuels. However, these two countries have been subjected to large criticism as their metal reserves are located in highly vulnerable Amazonian and desert ecosystems inhabited by indigenous and peasant communities. So in Chile, the metal reserves are located in the Atacama Desert, while in Ecuador, they are located in the Amazonian. The main objective is to understand from Latin American perspectives, and here, I mean, it is reduced to only 2 countries, but the idea is to understand how these policies, narratives behind the European energy transition can facilitate or counteract social and environmental just transitions, also happening in Chile and in Ecuador. There is a need to inquire for the extraterritorial impact of the European Green Deal in Latin America and how it reinforces both the climate crisis and also the continuous demand of these countries to increase the economic revenues influenced by the novel coronavirus pandemic, because current prospects for these countries estimate that 26 million people in Latin America will fall into poverty due to COVID-19. So in countries dependent on extractivism, the living conditions of poor campesino, peasants, and indigenous populations surrounding extractive zones pose long-term challenges for achieving the Sustainable Development Goals as well. So in this sense, and for this project, I take into consideration 3 theoretical perspectives that I'll talk about. First, I consider a global just transition to highlight the notion that transitions can only be effective if the fight against climate change has a global scale of action in addressing systemic inequalities. The just transition proposal was born from the labor movements that demanded responsible solutions to communities, social and environmental struggles, particularly for workers with high stakes in greenhouse gas intensive sectors, who aim to secure opportunities for jobs in low carbon sectors, while also urgently tackling climate degradation. So just transitions aim to protect working conditions, livelihoods, and economic and social rights of people. And this is a long-term commitment supported by the International Labour Organization. So a just transition is more challenging in countries whose economies are highly dependent on fossil fuel productions than the ones with more diversified economies. Thus, taking this mandate to a global scale, a global just transition highlights the importance of recognizing the difference between countries that have the capacities for change and those affected by decisions in a largely geographical context. Climate action needs to consider policies that commit to ending historical inequalities resulting from the international division of labor and reasserting alignment to global social and environmental justice goals. The second approach is telecoupling governance, to examine how global systems of production and consumption are closely interconnected and how transitions in developed countries will necessarily have implications abroad. Thus, regions at the forefront of the climate action need to consider the implications of an interconnected world. In this case, telecoupling governance is among the most prominent fields of study within global land systems, as it stresses the notion that socioeconomic decisions and actions in one geographical location have direct and indirect effects on distant parts of the global network of trading relations. So this concept has recently gained traction as it challenges the assumption of a decoupled global system, and instead points at how consumption in one place and production in another faraway place are inexorably linked. Global trading relations have been studied for a long time as concerns of governance arrangements or process to be technically fixed through collaborative bilateral actions or good governance and participation, or related to improvements in the global commodity chains or transnational sustainability. However, I argue that telecoupling is particularly pertinent because it problematizes global flows as systemic impacts embedded in specific sets of public policies and private interventions that have an effect on the environment and livelihoods of the people in distant places. And finally, a third approach is related to world ecology, that helps us reveal the close links between the economy and nature that has created a specific historical form of organizing societies in the globalized area. So what I mean is that the premises of world ecology help to draw on the historical links of transnational commodity systems in order to understand how capital flows have created a new organization of nature. And this organization has resulted in the expansion of a capitalistic world economy that exploits the environment in setting the frontiers of new capital accumulation through growing global systems of production and consumption. Ultimately, it has also resulted in the current climate crisis, and it has exacerbated uneven development around the globe. So in this case, world ecology stresses the importance of examining how global extractive flows are built within an industrial system with profound consequences for social and environmental justice. And this approach can also serve to understand asymmetrical power relations that sustain global economic status quo, jeopardizing the pursuit of just transitions for developing countries. Then I want to, for closing, I want to go back to the initial question of this presentation. How does Europe's green transition fit into climate justice? And that is the question that I invite you all to think about. But I want to put that any Europe's green transition critically needs to examine how a just transition could be achieved globally by targeting transnational supply chains for green technology, and not only by focusing on greening the European economy in a vacuum. Any transition needs to pay particular attention to the direct and indirect economic, social, and environmental effects that the European Green Deal can have in extractive dependent economies abroad. And there's time points for what a global dimension implies in transitioning with justice. And so far, most literature has mainly concentrated on a nation or region level, not on a global level. And I think we also need a closer examination of the extraterritorial implications of policies associated with a Green Deal in the global north. And in this case, the European Green Deal, I believe, is rapidly becoming a regulatory model that could define international policy making. Thus, discussions on green transition need to insert a conversation regarding demand-induced changes promoted by the European Green Deal and how they have effects on the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals and the national contributions for meeting the Paris Agreement in extractive dependent nations. Successful attempts to tackle climate change in meeting the Paris Agreements and the Sustainable Development Goals require transnational dialogue and coordination between multiple actors across governance levels to deeply examine its interconnected relations. And I think that research on global transitions entail breaching the conceptual limitations of methodological nationalisms for tackling climate change, and instead use an interdisciplinary approach linked to the political and material and discursive relations based on supply chains for energy transition. So overall, I'll say the main question missing in most conversation is how just can an European green transition be if social and environmental leakages beyond the European borders are not considered? Assessing the global discourse and material effects of the European Green Deal constitutes a critical academic inquiry, crucial to inform conversation internationally on the implication of achieving global just transitions, but also nationally to understand the political, economic, and environmental consequences of changes in global policies, and locally to examine how these changes relate to social and environmental justice and the achievements of the SDGs in places where large-scale extractive projects are happening. And with that, I'll finish, and I want to thank you all.
Thanks a lot, Diana, for these very important questions and perspectives. And now, before we can discuss this, we have some prepared comments from Robert Falkenberg. So, Robert.
Yes, thank you, Thomas. And thank you, of course, very much, Diana, for this very important exposition of your research ambitions. On a cynical note, whenever I hear such stories about what demining does in faraway countries, it makes me almost proud of still driving a smelly, smoky diesel car. Of course, we should get away from that, and I think your research has the potential to contribute to doing that in a just way. Yeah, and thank you for pre-sharing some written notes on your research, so I was able to prepare a bit. I think there are a few important things that I want to raise, and they are certainly not points of critique, but they are points at which I think additional reflection could be worthwhile. The first thing is, well, let me start with the most important question that I have, and that is essentially, what do you consider is the stuff of justice? What is the thing that justice needs to distribute in a fair and justified way? If you look at conventional theories of justice, then many of them just talk about social economic goods, right? That is, people should have a proper income, they should have access to education for their children, access to healthcare for the whole family. And I think that's important enough, but that's of course also not the whole story of justice. And a lot of theories on justice have been criticized for being too narrow on this. You mention quite some other things that can also be subject of justice. For example, the economic and social rights, and well, with social rights, I think importantly of things like being able to participate in political decision making and having freedom of speech and having freedom of conscience. In addition, you mention things like gender equality and class equality, issues of ethnicity and issues of indigenous rights. Those things are already much more complicated to bring under schemes of justice. And I think it's important that we try hardest to still do that. However, if I look at the three main theories of global justice that you present, so that's the global just transition, the telecoupling governance, and the world ecology perspective, I think much of that is still focused on these socio-economic objects of justice. So I was wondering if you embark on this research, how will you bring these more complicated things into those schemes of justice? And maybe as a side note to that, to me it is not crystal clear how the three theories complement each other. In my view, they are pretty much varieties of pretty much the same, namely a global scope on justice. But I think they share this narrow focus, not entirely, but largely, on socio-economic goods and not the less tangible things that can also be part of justice. Yeah, that was the most important thing I want to raise. Then there is some other point. I think it is very important that you put focus on the kind of spillovers or overflows that green initiatives in the West or the North entail in these supplying countries, let's say the mining countries. I was wondering whether, I mean, at some point you say that these things produce a lot of resource use, especially in those countries. I think that is true. But I was wondering whether, to what extent your picture is really a holistic picture, and whether you take sufficiently into account the good things, if I may call it that, that these initiatives do in the West. So, and then as a supplemental argument to that, I think the notion of displacement might be a very important one to use in your in your analysis and your presentation of the results later on, because displacement pays more attention to what happens at both sides of the connection, right? And it might be that even the net benefit at the global level is negative. I'm not sure. I couldn't distill that from your story. I think it is crystal clear that the net effects on the supply end are negative. But what it does in the overarching global economic perspective, I'm not so sure about. And maybe even the conclusion could be that we should not at all embark on these kinds of shift if the total balance is negative. I don't know. It's a question. Yeah, and then my last point is that well, you argue for making this connection between what we do in the global north and connecting that to what happens in the global south. I am then asking who in the first place thinks of these systems as uncoupled. I think in academia, you and I would, as a very first answer to any question, say, well, this is a global problem. So if the academic audience is your audience, then I'm not sure whether they will be surprised by this message. I do very much believe and agree that in policy, this blind spot is there. Or that the policy indeed has this pitfall of presenting nice solutions in Europe and disregarding what it does in the countries you're studying. But then the question is whether academic research can be a solution for a policy deficit. And if you believe it does, then the question still is, how do you think this additional research will help repairing this policy? So that's nothing about the intrinsic value of the research. I think it is important, but speaking to policy is an important challenge of its own. And I was wondering whether you have developed thoughts about that. Yeah, I think I leave it at this. Thanks again for sharing your research agenda, and I hope we have a bit of a fruitful discussion from this point on. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Robert. Diana, maybe you want to take some moments to reflect on these comments before we proceed?
I can move forward. I don't know how it works, or we receive more questions, or I just...
Maybe you want to respond to Robert first, and then we can sort of open the floor.
Okay. First of all, Robert, thank you so much for all your enriching questioning and inquiries. And I mean, I'll try to answer all of them. And I mean, comment on given the limited amount of time also to reflect on these questions that you have posed, but also on the limited time that we have for this presentation. But yeah, I mean, I agree with you that this needs a lot of discussion, right? And this is some initial inquiries and not necessarily exhaustive enough. But I think we need to pose, and my main concern here is posing the conversation on a multi-scalar level. It is not only talking on what is happening in Europe, right? And if we solve the problems in Europe, then we're fine. We're fine on the fight of climate change, or as long as we're fine, then what matters elsewhere is not our issue, it's other countries' issues, right? And I think the policy is still there, right? When the Climate Paris Agreement talks about national contributions on climate change or on reduction of emissions of carbon, they are still based on a national levels, right? There's not enough discussion of, okay, we need to, how are we thinking this issue on the interconnected relations that we all have? But to answer your first question on justice, you're right, the concept of justice can be very broadly. So I'll respond from the theoretical side that I'm coming from, right? I have been a researcher that has been studied from the perspective of political ecology and political economy and ecological economics. So I'll come from that side. And when I talk about justice, social justice and environmental justice, I'm mainly talking about three frameworks of analysis, right? Justice has to be related with participation in the terms of not only who is participating, but how decisions are being taken, and also who are able to influence decision-making, right? Participation is a key issue when discussing of justice. Who makes the decision? So because I'm coming from the perspective of the extractive producer countries, and the reserves, as I said, the mining reserves are located in vulnerable ecosystems where poor indigenous population live. When I talk about justice and participation in justice, I'm talking about how these population, how these communities are able to influence decision-making if countries, especially extractive dependent countries, are influenced by international decision-making and the historical division of labor that we have, right? So, and this is critical. I don't have an answer. I mean, this is the challenge of all dependent countries, right? I don't really have an answer for that. When I'm talking about justice, I'm also talking about the distribution side of justice, which is the one that you were talking, right? The economic distribution, how the benefits, economic benefits are being distributed and who is receiving this benefit. But not only that, when I'm talking about distribution, I'm not only talking about the benefits of it, but also the distribution of the impacts, the negative impacts, right? So who is receiving the benefits, who is not receiving the benefits, or how they are being distributed, how are they being allocated, but also who is receiving the negative impacts, because not all, I mean, the negative impacts are never equally distributed. It is indigenous communities, it is peasant communities will receive all of the environmental degradation and social degradation that extractive projects are producing. And the third element when talking about justice is about recognition. And this is more complicated, right? Because when I'm talking about recognition, it's not only talking on the imperative, the economic imperative of extractive countries to generate economic income for the country, for the development, for reduction of poverty, right? When talking about recognition, I'm also thinking about whose values are the ones that matter. Again, going back to the communities that live in those places where the reserves are located, are their values that in many cases, communities opposed to extraction, how their values, their ways of lives, their understanding are not being taken into consideration, again, in the decision making, right? So these three elements are really key for thinking about justice. And they are related with rights, with freedom of expression, with gender inequality, with ethnicity, with violence, as you have mentioned. So how these three theoretical levels complement with the idea of justice? I think the challenge here, I'll say, is that most literature on environmental and social justice have been focused specifically on what happens on the territorial local level, right? What is going on with the indigenous communities, with the peasant communities that are being displaced, dispossessed, destroyed, socially destroyed, right? I think, and especially in the literature on extractivism in Latin America, Latin America has produced probably the most enriching literature related to extractivism. But most of the literature there, again, relates only on the national scale or maximum on the regional scale, what is going on in Latin America. So here my challenge is, and that is the reason why I'm using this global perspective of understanding the multiscalar problems of the issue, it's to link these both bodies of theoretical frameworks. How I'm going to do it also depends on the capacities and the on the possibilities also that I have for obtaining the information and for contacting the key stakeholders, right, that are needed for understanding the justice perspective, which is mostly nationally or locally, with this more global telecouple governance perspective of what is happening, what are the demands on Europe, considering the challenges in Latin America. What else? Then you talk about you said, I mean, if we talk about the net benefits of doing a green transition, if I understood correctly your question, then probably there are more benefits than the problems, right? I mean, I think it also depends on the perspective of where you're coming from, right? My perspective, my academic intellectual perspective is that I don't side in that side. And if you ask me if the benefits are more than the cost of it, then I'll ask you, the benefits for whom, right? I mean, maybe there are more benefits, but it's not that the benefits are equally distributed. We talk about that. So when talking about benefits, then let's ask who is benefiting and who is missing, right? And I think that is the key question of political ecology. Who is winning and who is losing? And we need to understand that also to think about justice. We need to think about there will always be trade-offs, right? But at what point we're willing to forget the costs? And again, who will be the ones to receive all the costs? And again, I'm coming also from the colonial perspective, right? On the historical, the historical projects that have conditioning the lives of the people in the global South. And that is from where I located. So if you ask me if there is a net benefit that is higher than the cost, then let's go for it. Then I'll disagree because I don't think anybody will have to bear the cost of it. If we're thinking about justice, right? So I think a serious discussion needs to happen also here in Europe about whether the green transition is meant to increase the social metabolism on the idea is to increase the consumption that is demanding more raw materials. Then maybe we need to think about other economic frameworks to understand. We need to take into consideration also our behavior here, right? So I think in this perspective, frameworks as degrowth, for example, can be really complementary in this idea of thinking global just transitions, right? So then you ask also, and I totally agree with you, who will think that systems are decoupled? And yeah, for me, it is also very logical, and I'll totally go with you on that argument. But if you see the policies, if you see the European Green Deal, I mean, they are definitely decoupled, right? Because they don't consider the extraterritorial impacts that the European Green Deal will have beyond the European borders. So maybe the academy is thinking about that, but the policymakers are not. And so then it's to answering your, which I think it was your last question. Yeah, definitely this project is to also talk with policymakers, to inform policymakers The idea is not, the idea for this project will be to have a bipartisan discussion, a dialogue on thinking about these challenges. I mean, it is not easy. And as I said at the beginning, I don't have all the answers. This is just starting. It is not a process for one person. And I think this needs to be a project where many people are thinking about and proposing suggestions and collaborating. But I think it is our responsibility as academics also to speak to inform policymaking. I don't know if I was able to answer all of your questions.
Yeah, sure. If I may still respond in a few sentences, and then we should move to other people with questions. But I think your answers are very, very accurate, and I'm happy to have a cup of coffee at some point to further discuss it, because it is a very complex matter, and there's much to say about it. Just for clarity about this total balance, I didn't mean to imply that we should simply do it if the net balance is positive. But my concern was more that if you look only at the bad sides in halve, for example, then you do reproduce exactly the kind of decoupling that you argue against. That was my concern there. So it's a bit of a conceptual concern. And of course, we should be as articulate as we can about all the bad things that happen there. That's beyond question.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. No, and also to clarify, I'm not against green transition. I fully.
Yeah.
It's just we need to think about how we do it, and it's not only green transition here in Europe, but how we're transitioning everywhere.
Yeah. But I'll save my other comments for a later point. Thanks a lot for your answers.
No, thank you.
Yeah.